It was just a trench photo. But when you zoom in, experts are stunned. A single image from 1916, muddy trenches, exhausted soldiers, the chaos of war frozen in time. For decades, this picture sat archived as merely another record of the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. Historians catalogued it, preserved it, but rarely gave it a close look. Yet, when you enlarge this photograph, when you scrutinize every detail, something impossible jumps out. In the lower left corner, sitting alone in the muddy trench, a soldier wears an expression that shouldn't be there. Eyes wide, a broad smile plastered on his face. In the heart of the Somme trenches, surrounded by death and destruction, while his comrades tended a wounded man in the background, he smiled. And that smile reveals a truth about the war that took society a century to officially acknowledge. If you want to uncover hidden stories in historical photographs, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. You won't believe what history has preserved in forgotten images. The photograph resides in the archives of the Imperial War Museum in London. It documents the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, fought between September 15 and 22, 1916, during the Somme Offensive, one of the bloodiest campaigns of the First World War. At first glance, the image looks typical of war photographs from that time. British soldiers in a trench, uniforms caked in mud, Brody steel helmets, equipment scattered on the dirt floor. In the center, several men surround a wounded comrade, clearly concerned with helping him. The scene is familiar to any scholar of the First World War: crumbling earthen walls, the dense atmosphere of exhaustion that defined the Western Front trenches. But one detail, once noticed, makes it impossible to look anywhere else in the photograph. In the lower left corner, partially hidden by the trench wall's shadow, a soldier sits alone. His legs are bent, arms resting loosely at his sides. He's not helping the others. He's not looking at the wounded. He's doing absolutely nothing. Just sitting there, his face turned straight toward the camera. And he's smiling. Not a subtle smile, not a nervous half-smile. A wide grin, mouth open, eyes completely wide, as if posing for a family photograph on a happy day. But this was not a happy day. It was September 1916 at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, where tens of thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded in just 1 week. Back then, people didn't smile for photographs, much less in war trenches. To grasp how disturbing this image is, you need to understand the technological and social context of photography in 1916. Cameras of that era still required relatively long exposure times. Though technology had advanced since Victorian daguerreotypes, which demanded minutes of absolute stillness, you still had to remain motionless for several seconds to get a sharp image. Holding a natural smile that long was technically difficult. Facial muscles tire quickly, and the smile becomes forced, shaky, unnatural. So social convention dictated posing seriously, with dignity, with a neutral and controlled expression. Smiling in portraits was considered inappropriate, even vulgar. Serious, respectable people did not smile for the camera. This cultural norm was so strong it spanned decades. Just look at photographs from the 19th and early 20th centuries: solemn, composed, serious faces. But there was another reason nobody smiled in war photographs. There was nothing to smile about. The Battle of Flers-Courcelette was fought by the French 6th Army and the British 4th Army against the German 1st Army. It was where tanks were used for the first time in military history. It was also where the Canadian Corps and the New Zealand Division first fought on the Somme. On September 15, 1916, the Anglo-French attack began the third phase of the Battle of the Somme. By its end on September 22, the strategic objective of a decisive victory had not been achieved. Capturing the villages of Courcelette, Martinpuich, and Flers constituted a tactical victory. But the human cost was devastating. Soldiers faced constant artillery bombardment, poison gas attacks, and conditions that tested the absolute limits of human endurance. No one who lived through that was smiling, except the men in the photograph. And that wasn't normal. It didn't make sense, unless that smile wasn't a choice, unless it was a symptom. World War I was unlike any previous conflict, not just because of tanks, airplanes, or chemical weapons, though those innovations were devastating, but because of artillery. Artillery weapons caused 60% of all casualties in the First World War. Cannons positioned kilometers away fired shells that fell from the sky, turning trenches into instant graves. There was no heroism possible against artillery. No amount of courage could deflect a shell. No amount of military skill made a difference when a projectile landed directly in your trench. It was pure luck, being in the right place at the wrong time, or vice versa. And for the soldiers who survived day after day, week after week, the psychological impact was devastating. The sound of approaching shells was unmistakable, a sharp whistle that grew louder, cutting through the air. Soldiers learned to count the seconds, 1, 2, 3, maybe 4, before impact. And during those seconds, there was nothing to do but wait. Then came the explosion. The earth trembled violently. The air thickened with dust and smoke. Screams pierced the darkness. And when the noise stopped, silence followed, worse than the sound, because it meant it was time to look, to check who was still alive and who had been torn apart. This cycle repeated endlessly, not for hours, but for days, sometimes entire weeks. Soldiers didn't sleep properly, didn't rest. They lived in constant terror, knowing that at any moment the next howitzer could be the last sound they'd ever hear. The circumstances of the First World War pushed hundreds of thousands of men beyond the limits of human endurance. They faced weapons that negated any chance of heroism or courage, because the weapons that killed them were miles away. And eventually, inevitably, something would break, not the body, the mind. Soldiers themselves coined the term shell shock. Shell shock, war neurosis, the psychological collapse caused by prolonged exposure to artillery bombardment. The term was coined by soldiers because military medicine didn't yet have an official name for what they were experiencing. Symptoms were varied and devastating: extreme fatigue, uncontrollable tremors, mental confusion, nightmares that prevented sleep, impaired vision and hearing without apparent physical cause. Some men developed hysterical paralysis, their legs simply stopped working, even without spinal injury. Others lost the ability to speak, even with intact vocal cords. Some could no longer hold a rifle or a mug, their hands shaking uncontrollably. And there was a particularly disturbing symptom, less discussed but equally real: inappropriate affect. A vacant, bewildered look was typical, but some soldiers developed facial expressions completely disconnected from their actual emotions or surroundings. Soldiers who would start laughing for no reason, who would cry in moments of calm and laugh in moments of horror, whose expressions became random, inverted, paradoxical. Soldiers who smiled when there was absolutely nothing to smile about. The diagnosis was often made when a soldier proved incapable of performing his duties, with no obvious physical cause. In simple terms, even the most obedient soldier, after being hit by enough projectiles without any means of retaliation, often completely lost self-control. During World War I, an estimated 80,000 British soldiers suffered from shell shock severe enough to require documented medical treatment. But this number represents only official cases, those diagnosed and recorded. How many more suffered in silence? The truth is, we'll never know. In 1916, shell shock was not viewed with compassion. It was met with suspicion, distrust, sometimes outright contempt. Though it was recognized that the stress of war could lead men to collapse, a prolonged episode was often seen as symptomatic of an underlying lack of character. In his testimony to the post-war Royal Commission that examined shell shock, Lord Gort said that war neurosis was a weakness and was not found in good units. Many military officers believed soldiers were faking symptoms to avoid combat. As a result, men with nervous breakdowns often received less attention and sympathy than those with physical injuries. Wounds that bled were honored. A man with a leg shattered by howitzer shrapnel was a wounded hero, deserving of care and respect. But the man whose mind had been shattered by the same howitzer, he was questioned. His motives were suspect, his courage doubted. In extreme cases, he was punished. During the First World War, 306 British soldiers were executed for military crimes, including desertion and cowardice. Some of these men suffered from stress disorders that led to their breakdown. But a prolonged episode would likely be seen as symptomatic of a lack of character. It's unclear how many suffering from war neurosis were convicted of cowardice or desertion when, in fact, they were psychologically incapacitated. Witnesses at military trials reported soldiers visibly trembling, unable to articulate words clearly, displaying inappropriate facial expressions, all classic symptoms of severe shell shock. But these symptoms were not seen as evidence of illness, they were seen as evidence of guilt. These men were shot at dawn. It wasn't until 2006, 90 years after the war ended, that the British government finally granted a posthumous pardon to those 306 soldiers executed for cowardice and desertion, officially acknowledging the effect of war neurosis on its troops. 90 years to admit the truth. Let's go back to the photograph. That soldier sitting in the corner, smiling broadly with wide eyes. Now that we understand the context, the constant bombardment of Flers-Courcelette, the symptoms of shell shock, the inappropriate effect, we can see the image with new eyes. That smile is not joy, not relief, it is dissociation. It is the last gesture of a mind that can no longer process the surrounding horror and has entered a state of total psychological collapse. His eyes are wide but not truly focused. He looks toward the camera, but he doesn't see the photographer. He's looking through him, to some distant place that exists only in his fragmented mind. His mouth is open in a wide, unnatural smile, as if someone carved that expression onto his face and forgot to erase it. There's no genuine joy there, just an empty reflex, an emotional response completely disconnected from the reality around him. And there's another detail in the photograph that makes it all the more devastating: no one is looking at him. In the center of the image, several soldiers surround a wounded comrade. There's urgency in their movements, concern in their postures. They're clearly trying to help, to stop the bleeding, to offer comfort to a man with visible injuries. But the smiling soldier sitting just a few meters away, with his clearly altered expression, is completely ignored. None of the other men look his way. None seem concerned about his obviously compromised mental state. None are trying to help him. Why? Because visible wounds were understood. Invisible wounds were ignored, or worse, viewed with suspicion. His companions wouldn't look at him because they didn't want to see. Because acknowledging his suffering would mean acknowledging that any one of them could be next. So they looked away. They focused on the physically wounded person whose suffering they could comprehend. And the smiling soldier remained there, broken and invisible, even though he was right before their eyes. To fully grasp what that soldier experienced, we need to examine the Battle of Flers-Courcelette in detail. The battle began on September 15, 1916, with a massive Anglo-French attack. The artillery bombardment that was supposed to destroy German defenses was intense, but when the British infantry advanced, they found many enemy positions still intact. German artillery responded with devastating force. Shells rained down on British trenches. The earth trembled continuously. The air thickened with dust, smoke, and the acrid smell of explosives. Soldiers faced not only artillery fire but also gas attacks. In the early hours of specific days during the battle, the Germans released poison gas. British soldiers struggled to put on their masks before inhaling toxic fumes. Some didn't manage in time. For days on end, the bombardment did not cease. Soldiers in the trenches spent 38, 48, sometimes 60 hours without adequate sleep, without rest, under constant fire. The sound of howitzers became part of the very air, a constant, inescapable presence that penetrated not just the ears but the bones, the stomach, the very soul. Men watched their comrades being torn apart right beside them. The First World War was not a war of heroic one-on-one confrontations. It was a war of machines that killed indiscriminately from a distance. In that moment, in trenches like the one in the photograph, everything these men had been created for, the social structures that composed every aspect of their lives, simply exploded and shattered. They lay in muddy trenches, afraid to die, hearing and seeing death all around them, their entire psyche being destroyed. And eventually, inevitably, some broke down completely. The photograph captures one of those moments of total breakdown. This photo was taken by an official British Army photographer during the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. Military photographers were instructed to document war operations, including medical evacuations and trench conditions. The image shows exactly what was happening in those trenches, soldiers tending to the physically wounded while the psychologically wounded were ignored. We don't know if the photographer realized the importance of what he was capturing. We don't know if he consciously noticed that smiling soldier in the corner or if he was focused on documenting the medical care being given to the wounded men in the center. What we do know is that the photograph preserved something crucial: visual evidence of severe shell shock, evidence of inappropriate effect, evidence of a man in total psychological collapse. It also preserved evidence of how this suffering was treated, or rather, ignored. After the war, as photographs were organized and archived, images like this were often kept but not publicly displayed. Not because they weren't important, but because they were too important. Because they showed a truth that post-war British society was not ready to confront. The official narrative was about heroism, sacrifice, and victory. There was no room in that narrative for men smiling inappropriately in trenches, or trembling uncontrollably, or staring blankly into space with empty expressions. These images contradicted the story the nation wanted to tell about itself. But the photographs were preserved, archived, catalogued, stored, so that future generations could eventually confront the complete truth. And today, the truth is available for anyone who wants to see it. The medical and social understanding of shell shock has gradually evolved throughout the 20th century. After the First World War, British veterans suffering from war neurosis faced decades of stigma and lack of adequate treatment. Many lived with nightmares, tremors, and other symptoms for the rest of their lives without proper official support. During the Second World War, the lessons of the First were partially learned. There was greater recognition that prolonged combat caused psychological damage, and some treatments improved, but the stigma persisted. It wasn't until the Vietnam War, when post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was formally recognized as a legitimate medical diagnosis, that a broader understanding of war trauma began to emerge. Shell shock and PTSD are not identical, but they share fundamental characteristics. Both show how extreme mental stress leads to significant physical and psychological difficulties. And finally, in 2006, 90 years after the end of the First World War, the British government granted a posthumous pardon to the 306 soldiers executed for cowardice and desertion. The official acknowledgement admitted that many of these men were victims of war neurosis, not criminals. It was a recognition that took a century, 3 generations, and it came too late for the men who were executed, too late for their families who lived with the shame. But it arrived. And photographs like this one, showing that soldier smiling in total psychological collapse, served as historical evidence that invisible wounds were always real. It only took a century for society to finally admit it. Today, this photograph is available in the archives of the Imperial War Museum. Anyone can access it online, enlarge it, and examine every detail. And when people see it for the first time, when they zoom in on that lower left corner and focus on that face, the reaction is always the same: a moment of confusion. Why is he smiling? Followed by a growing discomfort as they realize it's not joy, it's a breakdown. We don't know who that soldier was. His name has been lost to history. We don't know his hometown, his age, his story before the war. We don't know if he survived the conflict, if he regained his sanity, if he managed to rebuild a life after the armistice. British military records from the First World War are extensive but incomplete. Many documents were lost in bombing raids during the Second World War. Others were never kept in sufficient detail to allow identification of individual soldiers in uncaptioned photographs. All we have is his face, preserved on photographic film for over a century, digitized and accessible now. And that face tells a story that words struggle to express. It tells of the psychological cost of industrial warfare, of men pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, of invisible wounds ignored, questioned, punished for generations. It tells how societies prefer narratives of heroism to uncomfortable truths. But above all, that face forces us to look, to see, to recognize. The smiling soldier from Flers Courcelette can no longer speak, but his preserved face speaks for him. It speaks for all 80,000 British soldiers documented with shell shock. It speaks for the countless others who suffered in silence. It speaks for the 306 executed before the truth was admitted. And its message is clear: war breaks not only bodies, but minds. And this breaking has always been real, even when the whole world refused to see it. More than a century later, we are finally looking. Finally, we are seeing that smile for what it truly is, not joy, but evidence of the most invisible and devastating wound of all, a human mind falling apart, preserved forever in a fraction of a second in September 1916, in a trench at Flers Courcelette, so that we never forget.